In today's video, we will learn what is the difference between an inverse agonist, antagonist, and an agonist. Also, can we label a ligand or drug as an inverse agonist or antagonist, or can an inverse agonist become an antagonist or vice versa? Finally, how to identify an inverse agonist, antagonist, or an agonist based on a dose-response curve. We need to know two important terms necessary to understand the principles of drug action or how a drug produces an effect. Affinity and efficacy. We will start with the term affinity. Let's assume this is our little receptor in three drugs, A, B, and C. Imagine a lock and key mechanism. Only a specific key could fit and open the lock. Similarly, for our little receptor, only drug A is a good fit. So, affinity basically is the love or fit of a drug for a particular receptor. It measures how readily and tightly a drug or ligand binds to a particular receptor. Efficacy, on the other hand, refers to the ability of a ligand or drug to activate and produce a biological response following binding to a particular receptor. In other words, the term efficacy signifies the production of a response by a ligand, and such a ligand is called an agonist. It is important to understand that receptor binding or a good fit does not always mean a drug is an agonist or has efficacy. For example, here drug D fits the same way into our little receptor but does not initiate a response. Thus, drug D is called an antagonist. Therefore, an agonist possesses both affinity and efficacy, whereas an antagonist only has affinity but zero efficacy. Based on classical or traditional receptor theory, receptors were assumed to behave like an on and off switch. To understand this, let's imagine this tap representing a receptor in resting or off mode. Drug E opens the tap fully, whereas drug F could only partially open the tap. Drug G just sits on the tap and does nothing. In this case, drug E is a full agonist. Drug F is a partial agonist. Drug G is a neutral antagonist, meaning it has affinity but zero efficacy. Therefore, based on traditional receptor theory, only a ligand or drug with affinity and efficacy could activate a receptor from its resting state. However, in the 1980s, receptor activity independent of a ligand was discovered. This figure represents our little active receptor, but there is no ligand attached to it. This is called basal signaling or constitutive activity. Here are some relevant scientific papers you can refer to for further reading. Let's go back to our receptor tap model with traditional receptor theory assuming a receptor as an on and off switch. Ligands with positive efficacy can activate the receptors. An antagonist with zero efficacy cannot turn on the receptor. The discovery of constitutive activity, which is basically unliganded receptor activity, further revealed some ligands that could actually reduce this basal signaling activity. For example, drug H could partially reduce this basal signaling and would be called a partial inverse agonist. Drug I could completely diminish this basal signaling and would be considered a full inverse agonist. In short, all drugs, E, F, G, H, and I, have affinity for this particular receptor. Drug E and F display positive efficacy and are called agonists. Drug G is a neutral antagonist with zero efficacy. Drug H and I are called inverse agonists, ligands with negative efficacy. This covers our first learning objective. So, can we label a drug as an inverse agonist or neutral antagonist, and will they always behave that way? Or can an inverse agonist become an antagonist or vice versa? Well, a ligand or drug can only reduce receptor activity if there is basal signaling. If there is no basal signaling or very low basal signaling, an inverse agonist and a neutral antagonist will be indistinguishable. For example, if you put drug G and H on our receptor in a resting state with no basal signaling, you would not see any effect of drug H, and both drugs would behave like an antagonist. On the other hand, if you put the same drugs on a receptor with basal signaling, only drug H would be able to show inverse agonism. Therefore, basal signaling activity is critical to differentiate an inverse agonist from a neutral antagonist. If you run a dose-response curve for these ligands or drugs, the curves would look like this. The red curve represents drug E, as it produced the maximal effect. The green curve represents drug as it could only produce half of the maximal response. Since drug G has zero efficacy, its response would be a flat line. Drug H and I would be represented by the yellow and purple curves based on their reduction in response, partially and fully, respectively. I hope this helps. Feel free to check out other videos and MCQs short. I wish you all the best in your journey. Don't forget to subscribe for future videos and like if you found this helpful.